Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now, back to the show. Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers, because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD, and working on a product to help people overcome these problems, because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions,
common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. My guest is Paul Marshall. He's a senior fellow, part of the Center for Religious Freedom. It's under the Hudson Institute. We're going to talk about what's happening with what appears to be the global assault on Christians and Christianity. So that's the topic we'll be talking about today. So welcome, Paul.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard.
Yeah, if you would, tell me a bit about your background and how you got to this point where, you're studying what's happening with Christianity worldwide.
I actually graduated in geology in England and then went to Canada to go to graduate school. And then after a couple of years, I switched to political philosophy, and I taught that in Toronto for about 25 years. And then when I got particularly interested in and concerned about religious freedom, which is in the 90s, I moved down to the U.S. in 1998 to the sort of think tank world. And I was initially at Freedom House and then the Hudson Institute, and I'm still at Hudson and the Religious Freedom Institute, both think tanky public policy places. And then I now also have a chair at Baylor University in Texas.
Okay. What is your current research and work about right now?
A range of things. Just on the religion, I'm doing some non-religious freedom stuff too. Maybe that would be an interesting aside. I've just finished a book on the friendship between John Perkins, African-American from Mississippi, born in 1930. John's still alive. He's 94. Amazing history. He's written quite a few books, but the friendship between him and a very rich California philanthropist, Howard Amundsen. And this wasn't just a case of Howard Amundsen funding John Perkins' work. John started a lot of self-development groups. There's over 1,000 of them in the U.S., but became friends. Families went on holiday together, and it's quite a remarkable relation that's still going on. So that's an aside thing, but 90% of my work is on religious freedom. I look at overall trends and patterns in the world, edited 2 world surveys of religious freedom, and there are particular countries in which I take an interest. One of those is Egypt, and another one is Indonesia, which is a fascinating place. So.
Okay, well, what are you observing right now in regards to religious freedom, Christianity around the world? What are you seeing?
Okay, religious freedom worldwide is generally decreasing. That's true for human rights in general and also for democracy. In general, most of the trend lines there are going down. You have highly impressive China, of course, but then in India, increasing religious intolerance. That's a lot of that in the Middle East. Also now increasingly in Europe and then Central Asia. So the trend lines are down, and that's for most forms of religious freedom. In terms of for Christians, probably the trend lines are going down even more, and I can talk about some of those patterns and reasons if you're interested.
Yeah, no, definitely. Tell me what you're seeing and why do you think you're seeing it?
Okay, one is we're talking about a global assault on Christians. It's not just one factor, one causation. There's lots of different trends going on. If I summarize them, you have the remaining self-declared communist countries, which we can argue about whether they're really communist in any real sense, but self-described ones at the moment are China, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba. And those still remain highly repressive of religion. And in North Korea, that's almost any religious expression, but they're particularly worried about Christianity because of its links overseas. In that case, you have authoritarian governments who simply want to control everything in their society. And religion, and especially Christianity, is a threat. You have other countries sort of ex-communist, but haven't changed much. Russia is a striking example. Its neighbor, Belarus, is like that. In Central Asia, you have the stands, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and so forth. And there's post-communist, but the policies haven't really changed much. So it carries on as before. So those are sort of two trends. A third is religious nationalism. People and regimes try to identify their country, their culture, their society with a particular religion. And this is now very strong in South Asia. I already mentioned India, sort of radical Hindu movements operating there. Also radical Hindu movements in Nepal. And then you get radical Buddhist movements in Sri Lanka and Myanmar. That may sound strange to people. Most Buddhists, like most Hindus, are, of course, not being repressive or violent, but there are such movements there.
What does it look like, radical Buddhism? It's weird. Is there a battle cry like Namaste before they hack apart their enemies? Or
No, usually not massacring people, but in Sri Lanka, tension between Buddhists and Hindus was one of the factors in the civil war. You've had Buddhist monks leading mobs to burn down churches and say, this is a Buddhist area, it's a Buddhist village, there shouldn't be a church there. In Myanmar, you have a very authoritarian government. It's a military junta, which has never been elected, but it tries to dress itself up in Buddhism to get some legitimacy. And most Buddhists would reject that. Their leaders have been imprisoned. But you have radical Buddhist movements, including one monk who describes himself as the Buddhist Osama bin Laden, been leading mob attacks, particularly on, Christians as well, more particularly Muslims. In the South, there's a Muslim population.
I wonder if Buddhists could be particularly dangerous or amenable to this because, again, this is just my speculation, but it seems like Buddhism is kind of a form of nihilism. Maybe I'm totally wrong. I don't know. Or it lends itself to nihilism.
Well, I don't think so. Buddhism is pretty hard to get hold of.
It just seems like the premise is, life is suffering and it sucks.
Then you slowly seek to move away from that, and then that suffering ceases, and you become, the old joke, what does the Buddhist say to the hot dog vendor? Make me one with everything. I'm not sure that that's a particular form of nihilism. If you actually look at the practitioners, say in Vietnam or Laos or Thailand, take someone like the Dalai Lama, it doesn't seem that the deeper currents there are nihilism. But I probably have to know much more than I do. I'm actually reading in Confucianism now. But I would say Buddhist majority countries sort of on a world scale have a fairly decent religious freedom record. When they're repressive, it's not the Buddhist, it's the communist. Like in Vietnam. Vietnam's majority Buddhist. But it's not the Buddhists closing down churches. It's the government which still calls itself communist. Same pattern in Laos. You get that sort of religious nationalism, that Myanmar belongs to the Buddhists, India belongs to Hindus. But then so that was 3 trends. The 4th trend is radical Islam, and which is you get the extreme forms like ISIS and Al-Qaeda or the Taliban in Afghanistan. But Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, even Egypt, could be highly repressive of their religious minorities, including Christians. Most people don't know it, but one of the oldest churches, that denominations in the world, is Egyptian. Usually called the Coptic Church, means Egyptian. Westerners had sort of Copt, Egypt, but they've been there since the first century. It's officially called the Church of St. Mark.
What does Egypt mean, the name? I'm going to ask you because, like you said, Egypt, etc.
I don't know whether the actual name, how English speakers got that name. Egyptians do not call Egypt, Egypt. It's Misr. It was probably when Westerners got there, maybe even Greek and whatever, when they were interested in the Coptic Church. There's about 10 million Christians in Egypt, and heard sort of Copt, Egypt, and whatever, and started calling the country after the sort of the Christian religion. How far back that goes, I don't know. But that it's not an Egyptian thing. It's not their self-description. So,
I guess, in the Old Testament, I was looking at Google, it says the name is Mizraim, is the real name given for Egypt in the Hebrew Old Testament. So is that what Egyptians call their country today, Mizraim?
Yeah, Misr. Usually, if you spell it in English, it's usually M-I-S-R.
Interesting. Okay. Well, what's I've heard. Well, in regards to Christianity, what are you seeing? Like I've seen in Israel, I guess there was a potential bill before the Knesset making it illegal, or I don't know, some kind of fines or punishments or arrest if you preach the gospel. Seems to be growing. What are some hotbeds where Christians are really having trouble, and why?
North Korea, always. North Korea, all religion is illegal, but if you're more shamanistic religion, you can sort of practice that on your own, and you can stay more hidden. Christians typically want to get together. It has a strong communal side, and that is dangerous. So possession of a Bible can get you sent to a labor camp along with your family. They'll send labor camps. That's the worst place in the world for pretty well everything. Religious persecution. China, especially under Xi, has become much more repressive. It's repressing the Muslim Uyghurs in Central Asia, still repressing Falun Gong, and increasingly repressive of Christians. They're demanding that churches install cameras in the pulpit, but not so you can see the preacher. The cameras are focused outwards, so the government can spy on who's in the congregation. Have started making changes to the Bible.
Where is this?
China.
Yeah, they want to surveil everything. How are they changing the Bible?
The story of the woman taken in adultery, you might remember, there's a crowd gathered, and they bring to Jesus a woman, said she was caught in adultery. Aren't we supposed to stone her? And then Jesus says nothing, but he draws in the sand. We're not sure what he said, but gradually, and then he says, let the person who is without sin, in King James Version, let the person who is without sin cast the first stone. Okay, those of you that never done anything wrong, you go ahead, you do it first. And the crowd slowly goes away. And Jesus says to the woman, go and sin no more. 2 things, so he's forgiving, but he also calls it a sin, doesn't say it's okay. And now China has changed that, so Jesus has her punished at the end, because they thought the original story encouraged lawlessness. Then China is also using religious prisoners for body part. They have, for transplants, you want a kidney or an eye or something of this kind. Prisoners in labor camps, particularly Uyghurs, they usually check with Falun Gong as well, and some Christians, they do a medical checkup for you. So if someone needs a particular organ, they already know whether you're compatible.
That's terrible.
There's, people are going to China or surrounding countries because if there's a queue for organ transplants, you can't get them here. Kick up enough money and China will do it for you. So that's bad. Afghanistan, any Afghan who is discovered to be a Christian will be killed by the Taliban, because the assumption is that all Afghans were Muslim. Therefore, if you say you're a Christian, you're an apostate from Islam, and the punishment for that is death. So when the U.S. did our rapid retreat from Afghanistan, all sorts of people were trying to get out, people who'd worked with the U.S. military and translators and people who we dumped back there. But also the Christians were seeking to flee. If they were discovered, they would be killed. So there were relief flights of Christians coming out of Pakistan, highly repressive. It has a blasphemy law. Well, it has 3 blasphemy laws, and anybody can be accused of blasphemy. But religious minorities are in greater danger, because if a Muslim accuses, say, a Christian of blasphemy and it goes to an Islamic court, the testimony of the Muslim is worth more than the testimony of the Christian. So if it's he said versus he said, and you're a Christian, you just lost. And the blasphemy laws carry the death penalty, though the biggest danger for you is not the government, but if you're accused of blasphemy, a mob will kill you. So those are some of the bad places. We haven't really touched on Africa, but dealing with radical Islam throughout West Africa, we've heard about this with the coups in various countries. But there are massacres of Christians taking place by ISIS in West Africa, particularly Nigeria. Now also East Africa, as going down the coast as far as Mozambique, almost to South Africa. And you have had, picking these words advisedly, in Nigeria, you have had thousands of Christians killed by radical Islamist groups in recent years, maybe up to 20,000. This is a thing which is hardly ever reported, and our own State Department downplays it.
Are there dominoes in this, where certain nations, if they keep going the way they're going with persecuting Christians, that you think it'll all of a sudden other nations will ramp it up big time? Or is it like a slowly simmering pot? Like, how do you see all worldwide activity in regards to Christians progressing over the next?
I would say slowly simmering. I mentioned at the beginning, this isn't just, one assault. There's not like one big, worldwide plot, let's go for Christians and others. There are these different trends, but they are worsening because religion's getting more mobilized. In fact, if I can give a sort of thought example, Indonesia is a country which I work in a lot. It's the world's largest Muslim country, and by and large, it's a pretty open and tolerant place. But imagine 150, 200 years ago, you were a Muslim villager in Java. There were no roads then. There would be paths through the jungle, and people would use carts and things like that. But you didn't worry about where you'd live, because you're going to live there. That's where your family. You wouldn't worry about what you were going to do. You were going to be a peasant, because that's all there was there. You wouldn't worry about what religion you were, because everybody you knew was a Muslim. These things were not choices you made in life. Those are things that you just inherited. You were born into a world, and things were unchanneled. So at many levels, it could be quite relaxed. But then you get what we're calling slowly modernity or globalization, or whatever term we want to use. And that might first appear that you get increased roads, so you start to see different people coming through your village. They may be of different religions. So if you're Muslim, suddenly aware of Christians, then there may be magazines or newspapers. And then someone in the village gets a radio, and you're learning about things elsewhere. Then you get a TV, and then you get the internet. And suddenly, all these choices are there. Well, maybe you could go to a town and study, go to university, get a different job, different ideas, live somewhere else, have a different religion. So what before was just assumed, you were born into it, now can be questioned. So that means that religious groups all over the world now have to become more assertive. Beforehand, you were just sort of, that's the way the world was, and you just accepted it. Now it's challenged. There are all sorts of challenges and differences and people questioning things, so you've got to push back. So religions are now more assertive than they were 100 years, 200 years ago. And that's across the board. Secularists are more assertive too. One aspect of that is militancy. Just because you're assertive, it doesn't mean you're going to have to be violent and repress other people. It just means you're going to sort of push back. But it does tend to lead to increased militancy and then denial of religious freedom to others. So a lot of this is to do with what we call globalization, or whatever term we want to use.
What, because of globalization, the nations take their cues? Again, like I'm saying, are there leading nations that are being watched, let's say, by other nations? And if they start persecuting, they say, all right, they're doing it, we're going to do it too. Do they all learn from each other? Like, how does this dynamic work?
I think not too much. Just on the globalization thing, it's sort of globalization challenges traditional societies. So they've got to become more assertive if they want to be able to stand up in this sort of gale which is hitting them. In terms of countries, they may learn from each other. If they see another country's getting away with it, they may imitate it. But usually they have common interests. Vietnam has not become more militant in the last 5 or 6 years on religion because China has. It's just, it feels itself more threatened. Similarly with the Taliban, they're not picking this up from some of the original ideology was from Saudi Arabia. But generally, no, maybe with one exception, that when you're getting more aggressive forms of Islam, Islamist, political Islam, that's also missionary religion, that is, they want to spread that. So you get people from more repressive places like Saudi Arabia or Afghanistan for Sunnis, or for Iran for Shia, who go into other Muslim countries and say, which are more open, like Indonesia, and say, you guys are, you're not really good Muslims. You got to get with the program. And you got to make sure that these other religions don't develop. And if someone converts, they've got to know they're going to be killed. So in that sense, within radical Islam, there is that sort of expansion and imitation. With the other countries, it much more what they see in their own interest or their national pride.
How have you seen historically that a country can come back from the edge, come away from persecution? Like, how does that happen?
Some countries were persecuting because they were controlled by others. I mean, one of the most remarkable ones is talked about, I mentioned the fall of the Soviet Union, but Russia is still repressive, so is Belarus and Central Asia. But 3 countries which are part of the Soviet, well, several more, the Baltics, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, some of the most religiously free places in the world, they have changed. Ukraine has its problems, but much more religiously free than Russia, and places such as...
well, recently Ukraine seems to be going the opposite way, persecuting Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox Christians.
Yeah, well, that gets complicated. You've got 3 different Orthodox churches in Ukraine, and one of them is allied with Russia. And Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, is also the head of one of the denominations within Ukraine itself. And so one of the fears is in Ukraine is that you have these churches and you have these clergy allied with the Russians, and worry that some of them may be so much allied that they may be spying for them. That's what's lying behind these things. But there are 2 other Orthodox churches, denominations operating in Ukraine. There's competition between them. And lots of other religions too. Eastern Rite Catholics is a very large church there. Protestantism is growing. And so, as I say, if you want to compare Ukraine to Russia, it's much better. But several of the post-Soviet countries have improved, except with now the growth of ISIS affiliates. Sub-Saharan Africa has been pretty well religiously free. And the country we haven't touched on, Latin America, is one of the most religiously free continents around. There's exceptions.
It's primarily Catholic, right? South America?
Yes. And it used to be more repressively Catholic. You had established Catholic churches. Protestants could have a difficult time. But especially since the Second Vatican Council, it's very much opened up. So countries such as Brazil or Peru may have other problems, but religious freedom is not one of them. They're still majority Catholic, but a much more open Catholicism. The repressive places are still like Cuba or now Nicaragua, which has become very repressive in the Catholic Church. Ortega is still in there. If you remember, you may not have been born there, but with the fight with the Sandinistas 30 and more years ago, and it was hoped that they were sort of Marxists. They said, well, no, we're really nationalists. We believe in pluralism. We'll have an open government. Well, guess what? I mean, they were out for a while, but no, they're now highly repressive. And the president they had 30 years ago is still the president, and his wife's the vice president, by coincidence. It just in general, Latin America is a place which has improved, except for militant Islam, especially in Nigeria. Much of sub-Saharan Africa is there. Europe is getting more repressive. Usually you get a few things. One is there's more control and fear of Muslims. Secondly, with radical Islam, you get radical Muslims carrying out attacks, say on the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, or massacres at concerts, hundreds of people killed, Ariana Grande conference. So you're getting increased level of violence there. Many secular Europeans are very nervous about what they keep calling sects, that is S-E-C-T-S, who they, without very much evidence of brainwashing people, and then increasingly secular and demanding that life be secular. Just one example, it's been in the news. There is a German couple who didn't want to send their children to a German state school, but German law requires it. So they fled Germany and found refuge in the United States, where they've been for about 10 years. Now the government's threatening to send them back to Germany, where they're likely to lose their children unless they send them. So that's a dramatic example, but you're getting that more secular mindset of distrusting independent religion.
Why does persecution seem to ramp up, and what are the factors that make it, get a lot worse suddenly in a place?
One is, I mentioned earlier that globalization tends to make religions more assertive, and that can affect religious freedom. Another factor with Christianity is the distinction between the authority of the church and the authority of the state. Christianity has always held that there are, at least when it got access to political power, that there are two rulers, a spiritual ruler and the secular ruler, and one should not usurp the authority over the other. One of the things this meant is the state could not claim to control all of society. The church needed its independence. And bear in mind, when we talk about a church then, we're not talking about just First Methodist down on the corner. The church was the education system. I mean, if you got educated, it was going to be in church seminaries and church-related universities. The church was the media. If the king wanted to announce new taxes, he couldn't put an ad in the newspaper. There would be a declaration which would be read out from the pulpits. That's how you got news. So a very influential body. And so this has meant that within Christianity, Christians have often been lousy at doing it, a very strong assertion of the independence of the church from the state, from government. And when you get authoritarian governments, that is a threat to them. The late Samuel Huntington, probably the best political scientist in the United States in the last half of the 20th century, said that with Christianity you distinguish God and Caesar. He says, but in radical Islam, God is Caesar. In communism, Caesar is God. So that bifurcation in Christianity is a threat to authoritarian government. And that's why there are places where Christians may be persecuted, whereas other sort of more passive religions are not. So what Americans miscall separation of church and state is not an American thing. It goes back to, mentioning the Old Testament. The priests and the kings and the judges were not the same people, and they had different authorities, and they were not to try and usurp one another. That goes back, within the roots of Judaism as well as Christianity. So that means that Christianity can be a challenge to communist governments, any government which doesn't want a more plural society. So that's another major factor. Maybe a third one with Christianity, I mentioned earlier that in a traditional pattern in the sort of my thought experiment of a village in Java where things weren't channeled, traditionally you were going to be what you were born to be. You were going to be a farmer or a peasant. You were going to live in this village. You were going to be a Muslim. That was a given. The question of choices just didn't come up. But one thing about Christianity, and not just evangelicals, who's saying you're not stuck with what you were born to. You can, in fact, be born again. And that means not just a saving experience of Jesus Christ, but life can be changed. Old patterns can be broken. New things can come into existence. In that sense, That's not just an evangelical thing. Catholics and Orthodox and others would say something similar. So the response to globalization, secondly, the fight for the independence of the church from the state, and the possibility of things starting again, challenges traditional societies. I think those are three major factors.
Okay. Well, very good, Paul. What's the best place for people to find out more about your work? Where can they go?
Probably the best initial source is the Hudson Institute. On their website, any articles I publish, either boring scholarly ones or more lively journalistic ones, Hudson will reprint those, put them on a website, give you a link. So that's an easy way to get a couple of online magazines I recommend and I write for frequently. One is called Religion Unplugged. It's a weird name. I voted against having it, but other people like it. And that's probably the best online source of religion news in North America right now. It's very good. Another magazine online called Providence on Christianity and foreign policy that deals with international relations. So I write in those quite a bit. Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor University will also, if you go to their website, will provide links to any of my recent writing.
Well, very good. Thank you much for being on the call. I appreciate it, Paul.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for having me, Richard.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.